what we put in is then what we have to give out, and how our body can process that on a cellular level, right? And so absolutely, and that gut brain, that gut mind connection, you know, there's some books out there, and they've even talked about how your brain, your gut is actually like a second brain, right? And so I know you mentioned that you've had a podcast recently about that gut, you know, healthy guts and things, you know, and so it's huge, and I don't think we realize how that contributes to our mental state, but it really does. It really does. And so, yeah, I definitely believe there's a connection there. So
I loved how you hit on not only like the food that we physically consume, but the mental food that we're consuming as well. Are we consuming things that are not good for our mental space, or are we consuming things that are good for our mental space? How are we spending our time in the car and stuff like that? So I feel like that was a very important part that you hit on there, that was like, ooh, yeah, that one was good. But the gut and the brain, like, if they're not communicating correctly because of some sort of imbalance in our body, the sugar that you mentioned, then we're not going to be able to process those emotions the way that we might be able to if our cells were communicating on a balanced level like they're supposed to be. So yeah, that was really good, and I feel like we could have a whole episode just on that.
For sure.
So what do you think are things that really contribute to unhealthy emotions, or being in that state of, you kind of hit on this when you were talking about how you wanted to grow and you felt like you weren't emotionally as evolved as you wanted to be. Are there things that can kind of keep us in that unhealthy state of emotion, or are there things like routines and stuff like that that can really help us to get in that healthy state of emotions?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, because like we talked about, like how we treat ourselves physically is going to put us on one side or the other, right? And that self-awareness is going to be a key factor in that, because understanding what our needs are, right? If we don't understand our needs, if we don't understand ourselves, we have a harder time being able to have those needs met. And what we try to do is then we try to get those needs met even though we don't understand really consciously what we're doing, from external sources. So whether that is like social media, or it's food, or it's some other addictive substance, right? Could be like in our relationships, and we create unhealthy relationships by trying to meet our own needs on others, right? And so I feel like that self-awareness piece is really key here too, in staying stuck or getting unstuck. And knowing what help we need, because when we're stuck inside of ourselves and we're just repeating the same messages to ourselves, it's hard to get to that next step of being able to get unstuck, right? And so I really feel like the way that we treat ourselves is so important, and how we, and this is where I think my perfectionism was a big hindrance, because I was in a state of more victimhood. When I go there, it's like I want to blame other people. I want to be able to just put up my walls and not be vulnerable and not talk about it, and I get really stuck in that space because I don't want to share, because if I share what's going on with me, then I'm showing that weakness, right? That imperfection and all those things that I don't want to be. And that beating myself up as well, instead of finding what works, it creates a space where you just ruminate in the same state, right? And so for years I would do that. Like, I'd do something that I didn't like about myself, and then I'd beat myself up for it and feel like that was how I then would deal with it, instead of how do I get better at that thing? I would be like, oh, I suck, I'm not good enough, like all that negative messaging. And so that's how I would stay stuck, was just beating myself up and telling myself that I wasn't a good enough person. And that is really, really unhealthy, you know? And like I said, stay stuck, and
it's hurtful. It's hurtful to yourself. It hurts so much.
Well, and you hear people, well, you wouldn't talk to your girlfriend like that. And you're like, you're right, I wouldn't. But I'm not my girlfriend, I'm myself, and I'm really used to it. And we create those patterns, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so something that I feel like is really important to talk about too is that something that I've learned is that when we're working on improving ourselves and making a powerful personal change, we have to realize that there are hardware and software changes, okay? And so what I mean by that is, in our physical space, we can change something, right? We can change something, we can eat better, we can exercise better, we can do different things that kind of shift ourselves physically, and we can learn things like reading a book or something like that. And those things are like hardware. They're like the nuts and bolts of things, right? But the software changes, the software shifting happens in our heads over time. And that is because we have all of those neural pathways in our head. Like, it's kind of like these paths that just, we wear a really good path on these habits that we have, whether they're positive or negative. And so we want to be able to make those software changes that over time create a new path. You know, and so in order to do that, we have to shift something physically that helps us to see where we can make those software changes. And as we make those software changes over time in our minds, we will wear new paths with new habits and take on a new direction, because we can see, okay, a lot of times I'm like, I read this book and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was so good. I am going to do everything right now because I have all information. But that's not how it happens. We need remember that those software changes are going to be much more difficult to then shift, because they take time, and that's okay. And it's so important to give yourself grace when you're in that space of growth, because we quit too soon when we think, oh, it's not working, I'm always going to do the same things, I'm never going to get better, like that negative self-talk. But it takes time. It takes time.
So for a new person really just thinking and hearing about all this emotion, who may be struggling with what you're expressing today, what is a first step that you would tell them to take in order to change that unhealthy situation that they're kind of cycling through life with?
So I love this question, because we often try to jump in and shift, like I just said, everything at once, and that's not how it works. And so doing just one thing, right, these micro changes. If you've never read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, highly recommend that one. But that creating that space between the stimulus, like something that happens, and our response is so important to being able to manage the emotions that we do have. And so I would say the first step is creating a routine of mindfulness. And so what I recommend first is to do something. It's not doing more, it's doing something different, okay? So because we all usually have pretty busy lives. And so to take that space where you give yourself just something, a time where you can be mindful. So one of my favorite things is when you're in the shower, taking a shower, and you take 1 minute to focus on something, like the sound of the water, or the way the water is hitting your body, or the smell of your shampoo, or something like that, where you take a minute to just stop and really focus on that thing that you're experiencing in the moment. And you can do that anywhere, like as long as it's not going to distract you from driving or something important, right? You know, like maybe you're cooking dinner or something like that, and you start taking just a minute to think about how it smells, or the color of the vegetables that you're chopping, or something like that, where you become more conscious of what you're doing. Okay?
Yeah.
And so that would be my first recommendation.
That's really, really good. You know, you hear that a lot, and I feel like that's why time goes by so fast, because we're not present. We're not like consciously aware of the things that we're doing. We're thinking about 50 other things while we're in the shower. We're thinking about many other things when we're doing a specific thing. So that's why I feel like time passes us so quickly, and you know, practicing that mindfulness, I feel like, can be very important, not only for this, for practicing those mindfulness routines in order for emotions, but to slow down the time too, and for us to really be present. I feel like in today's world, it's very, very hard to be present.
Yes, and I think with the space that I'm in, with my personal business of doTERRA and working with essential oils, I have to bring this in here, because at this point it's like, so essential oils are amazing in the fact that they work both physically and emotionally, which when you use an essential oil aromatically, and I think that this is something so simple that you can do as well, is when you just smell an essential oil, it actually goes directly to that limbic system of your brain. And so when we are using an oil, it works at that cellular level physically to calm us down, because it works right with your limbic system and that amygdala and the hippocampus, and which I absolutely love, because it has both that physical, like we're talking about, but also the emotional effects that we can powerfully change what mood we're in or how we're feeling, and shift the energy when we use an essential oil to do that. And oh my gosh, it's one of my favorite things to do, because all of these things that we're talking about, we can use an essential oil to help magnify those benefits for what we're already doing, right? Because I'm trying to be more mindful, and so I can use an essential oil that helps me to then bring my mind into a space where it brings it back into that frontal lobe. And there's just so many things that you can do with the oils, and what they can contribute to your process. It kind of amplifies what you're already doing when you choose an oil that will support your own personal goals, which has been amazing for my own growth, for sure.
Yeah, I definitely need to get some of those. And if you're hearing this and you want to get some essential oils, definitely message me and I can get you Jackie's information so that she can send you some more information on that, because she definitely knows what she's talking about with her essential oils and all the supplements from doTERRA, which is an amazing product. So thank you for sharing that. So this question is more so for women out there in relationships, and not necessarily maybe a direct relationship with like a significant other, even though those are typically the relationships we see the most growth that needs to take place in. But even with like a mom and a daughter, or a woman and another friend, let's say one is more emotional and one is more logical. How do you recommend the two of them communicate on a level where the emotional person can understand logically and the logical person can understand emotionally? How can they grow together in that?
I really appreciate this question. I think what's interesting is that you talk about somebody more emotional and somebody more logical. What's really interesting is that we all have emotions, right? It's only the way that we express them. And so we kind of label each other, oh, you're just emotional, or you're just too logical, or whatever. Right. And I feel like when we do that, we're missing the point. Because it really isn't about whether I'm more emotional or whether I'm more logical, because I'm having emotions regardless of how I personally will express them. Right. A lot of ways it's because of how we were raised, right? Because we're like showing our emotions may be considered bad in some like social situations or how you've been raised, and whether or not you express them a certain way or not isn't really the point, because when